All right, so today we're getting into the nitty-gritty of how some really cool early clinical trial designs are being used. Like, we're not just talking theory here.
Right.
We're going deep into real-world examples, the stuff that's actually happening in studies, and pulling out those practical learnings.
Yeah, absolutely. You've gathered some really interesting scientific literature for us to dig into.
Oh, yeah?
And our mission today is to break down some specific cases of these adaptive designs in action.
Right.
We want to see how that flexibility, how being able to adapt the trial as it goes
Yeah.
actually leads to smarter drug development and better, more useful results.
Okay, so for anyone who's tuning in, maybe hasn't heard the term adaptive designs before, what's the basic idea?
Sure. So it's not just about changing things mid-study, right?
Right.
The core concept is that these changes are planned out in advance.
Oh,
There
okay.
are possibilities that are built into the trial design, and they're triggered by the data that's being collected as the trial progresses.
So it's like having a roadmap with detours.
Exactly. It's like having a roadmap with detours, and these detours are already marked, right?
Right.
So as you gather information along the way, about how well the drug is working, or if there are any unexpected side effects,
Yeah.
you can then decide to take the most informative detour.
Yeah.
Whether that means adjusting the dose of the drug, refining the group of patients that you're studying,
Right.
or even adding new treatment arms to the trial.
I see. So it's a way to constantly optimize the trial as it's happening, right?
Yeah.
Rather than sticking to this super rigid plan that might end up being like inefficient.
Yeah,
Or even causing you to miss crucial information.
precisely. You don't want to be stuck with a plan that's not working, right?
Right.
And one of the earliest ways adaptive designs were used, and something that researchers are still refining,
Okay.
is in figuring out the right dose of a drug, especially in those early phase I trials.
Yeah.
So traditional methods, they often involve giving escalating doses of a drug to different groups of participants.
Right.
But adaptive designs can make this whole process much smoother. You're using the safety and tolerability data that you're gathering in real time
Right.
to guide you to which doses to test next. So you could potentially zero in on that optimal dose much faster.
That makes total sense, especially in terms of making the trial more efficient.
Right.
You also mentioned refining the patient group.
Yes.
How does that work in practice?
So this often falls under the umbrella of what are called enrichment designs.
Okay.
And actually, the clinical trials and neurology source, it really highlights how much interest there is in these approaches, especially for chronic conditions.
Okay.
The basic idea is that as you're collecting data, you might start to see that a certain subgroup of patients,
Yeah.
maybe those with a specific biomarker,
Uh-huh.
are responding way better to the treatment.
Okay.
So what you can do is adapt the trial to enroll more participants from that specific subgroup.
Got it.
So then you can get a much clearer signal of whether the drug is actually effective.
Right. So instead of maybe diluting the results.
With people who aren't going to respond to the drug anyway,
Yeah.
you're focusing on the folks who are actually showing a benefit.
You got it. It's about making the most of the data and really understanding who the drug works for.
And I imagine this is super important when you're dealing with a limited number of patients.
Oh, absolutely. And that's something that the small clinical trial source really emphasizes.
Right.
When you only have a small group of participants,
Yeah.
using these optimized designs becomes even more crucial to making sure you can draw meaningful conclusions.
So let's dive into some concrete examples here.
Okay.
Oncology is one area where we've seen a ton of innovation in trial design.
Right.
And the Anti-Cancer Drug Development Guide gives us some really interesting historical perspective, right?
It does. It talks about this study from 1974 by Mortel and his colleagues.
Mm-hmm.
They were looking at phase 2 chemotherapy trials for gastrointestinal cancer.
Okay.
And their findings, well, they were a real
What
eye-opener.
did they find? They showed how having these broadly defined patient populations in a trial
Mm-hmm.
could completely mask the potential benefits of a drug in a smaller group of patients who might actually respond really well to it.
Oh, wow.
It wasn't just about being careful about who you include in a trial. It was a much bigger realization.
Mm-hmm.
It was about recognizing that traditional rigid trial designs
Mm-hmm.
just couldn't handle the complexity of how different people respond to drugs.
Right.
And this was really a turning point, a direct path towards the more adaptive approaches that we're talking about now.
So those earlier trials, in a way, they showed us what not to do
Yeah.
and sort of paved the way for these more nuanced approaches that adaptive designs can offer.
Exactly. I mean, think about it. A drug might show no benefit overall in a mixed group of patients,
Yeah.
but it could be incredibly effective for a smaller subset of those patients.
That's a really important point. And how has that thinking evolved in oncology trials today?
Well, now we see these biomarker-driven approaches being incorporated more and more. So let's say a drug is designed to target a specific mutation.
Okay.
An adaptive design might start by enrolling a wider range of cancer patients.
Right.
But then, as data starts coming in about how those with and without the mutation are responding,
Mm-hmm.
the trial can shift gears and focus on enrolling more patients who have that biomarker.
I see.
And that lets researchers get a much more efficient assessment of how well the drug actually works in the people who are most likely to benefit from it.
That makes a lot of sense, especially with these targeted therapies that are becoming so prevalent.
Right.
Now, let's switch gears a bit and talk about biologics,
Okay.
a whole different class of drugs,
Yeah.
and the pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics of biotech drugs source
Yeah, great source.
really highlights some unique challenges with biologics,
Yeah,
particularly around something called immunogenicity.
that's a big one.
So can you break down what immunogenicity is and why it's such a big deal for biologics?
Sure. So one of the main differences between biologics and those smaller molecule drugs is that biologics have the potential to trigger an immune response in the body.
Okay.
They're larger, they're more complex,
Right.
and so they can sometimes cause the immune system to react in ways that those small molecules don't.
Interesting. And what kind of impact can these immune responses have?
Well, they can actually be quite varied. And the pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics of biotech drugs source actually goes into some detail about this.
Oh,
They have a table 8.2, that shows all the different types of immunogenicity that can occur.
okay.
But basically, these responses can range from, mild to really severe,
Mhm.
and they can affect both the safety and the effectiveness of the drug.
So a traditional trial design might not be able to fully capture these longer-term effects.
Exactly. Traditional trials are often designed around the idea of acute exposure to a drug, right?
Right.
You give the drug, you watch for a short period of time, and you see what happens.
Yeah.
But with biologics, those immune responses can develop over much longer periods, and they can be really unpredictable.
So you might miss something important if you're not looking for it.
You might see that the drug seems effective initially,
Uh-huh.
but then months or even years down the line,
Yeah.
the patient starts to develop antibodies that neutralize the drug,
Oh, wow.
and then suddenly it's not working anymore.
So how can adaptive designs help with this?
Well, they offer the flexibility to build in longer follow-up periods, for one thing.
Mhm.
So you can monitor those patients for a longer time and watch for any delayed immune responses.
Right. And if you start to see those responses.
Yeah, if you see that a significant number of patients are developing antibodies, for example,
Uh-huh.
then you can adapt the trial protocol.
Okay.
You might investigate different dosing strategies to see if that makes a difference.
Right.
Or even explore ways to kind of dampen the immune response in future participants.
Wow. So you're almost learning and adapting on the fly,
Yeah.
but in a very controlled and scientific way.
Precisely. You're building that learning process right into the trial design.
That's pretty amazing. Do you have another real-world example? Maybe
Yes.
something in the area of like gastrointestinal inflammation.
Sure. Actually, the same source, the pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics of biotech drugs,
Okay.
talks about some really interesting research that was done on antisense oligonucleotides, or ASOs.
Okay.
This was at Ionis Pharmaceuticals,
Mm-hmm.
and they were looking at using ASOs to treat local inflammation in the colon.
Okay, so not a systemic treatment.
Right, they were looking at local delivery.
Okay.
And what's really cool is that they found that when they administered these ASOs directly to the colon
Uh-huh.
using retention enemas,
Retention enemas, okay.
they were able to achieve much, much higher concentrations of the drug in the colon tissue
Okay.
compared to when they gave the drug intravenously.
Interesting.
And we're not talking about a small difference here. Table 10.1 in that source shows that the difference was huge.
Huge, like how huge?
Well, after just a couple of hours, the concentration of the ASO in the colon tissue
Yeah.
was something like 100 times higher.
Wow, 100 times higher with the local delivery.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable, right?
It is. And you're saying that this approach could be really useful for treating conditions like inflammatory bowel disease.
Exactly, and this is where adaptive trial designs come in. Imagine a trial that's evaluating this local ASO delivery.
Okay.
They might start the trial with a certain dose and frequency of the enemas,
Mm-hmm.
but then, based on early data,
Right.
like how much the inflammation is being reduced,
Okay.
which they could measure through things like endoscopy or biomarkers. They
Right.
could adapt the dosing regimen as they go.
Got it.
So they might find that some patients need a higher dose,
Okay.
or that others who respond really quickly can actually do well on a less frequent schedule.
So it's about personalizing the treatment based on how each individual is responding.
Exactly. And that's a level of fine-tuning that you just can't get with traditional trials where everyone gets the same dose.
Right. And especially when you're talking about systemic treatments, it's much harder to control where the drug is going and how much is reaching the target tissue.
Right.
So these examples really show how versatile these adaptive designs can be.
They do.
But these innovative approaches don't just exist in a vacuum, right?
Of course not.
What role do regulatory bodies like the FDA and the ICH play in all of this?
Oh, they're crucial. Their main focus is on making sure that any new medicine that comes to market is safe and effective.
Right, of course.
And so they provide guidelines and frameworks that influence how all clinical trials are designed and conducted,
Yeah.
including these adaptive trials.
Okay.
And while they're definitely supportive of innovation that can make drug development more efficient, they also emphasize the need for rigorous scientific methods and ethical considerations.
So it's not just a free-for-all.
No, not at all. The small clinical trials source actually talks about this.
What does it say?
It stresses the importance of having well-defined objectives for the trial, clear rules about when and how you can make adaptations, and the right statistical methods for analyzing the data.
So even with an adaptive design,
Yes.
you still need to be really rigorous about how you select your participants.
Absolutely. And sources like New Drug Development Regulatory Paradigms really highlight this.
Yep.
You need to make sure you're studying the right group of people
Right.
and that the results you get are actually meaningful.
So it's not just about being flexible, it's about being flexible within a really strong scientific framework.
Exactly. The flexibility needs to be built in from the beginning,
Okay.
not just thrown in as an afterthought.
So everything needs to be planned out in advance,
As much as possible, yes.
including how you're going to analyze the data.
Right. You have to specify all of that in the study protocol beforehand.
Got it.
That way you can ensure that the trial is scientifically sound
Yeah.
and that the regulatory agencies will have confidence in the results.
So thinking about all of these examples we've discussed,
Yeah.
what are the key takeaways here? What have we learned from seeing how these adaptive designs are being used in the real world?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that adaptive designs are not just theoretical ideas.
Right.
They're actually being implemented successfully in all sorts of different therapeutic areas
Yeah.
and for different types of drugs.
We've seen that.
We've seen how they can help refine patient selection in oncology trials so that you're focusing on the patients who are most likely to benefit from the treatment.
Right.
And with biologics,
Yeah.
they provide that flexibility to monitor for and potentially even counteract those complex immune responses that can happen over time.
And we saw how they can even be used to optimize local drug delivery
Exactly.
in things like inflammatory bowel disease.
Right. By adjusting the dosing based on how the patient is responding.
It's like they allow for a much more tailored and efficient approach to evaluating new treatments.
Precisely. And they have the potential to give us more informative data, sometimes even with fewer participants. And they allow us to optimize those dosing and treatment strategies in a way that just isn't possible with those traditional fixed trial designs.
So the learning process is baked right into the trial itself.
It is. It's like a constant feedback loop.
Yeah.
You're getting information, you're adapting, you're learning more, and then you're adapting again.
And it's not just about designing individual trials better. It's about changing how we think about drug development as a whole, right?
Absolutely. And one of the things that's really crucial for all of this is understanding how drugs work in the body,
Right.
their pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics.
Yeah.
We need to integrate all of that knowledge into how we design these adaptive trials
Okay.
and how we interpret the results.
So to sum up our deep dive into these real-world examples,
Yeah.
what's the main message you want our listeners to take away?
The main message is that these innovative early trial designs, especially these adaptive designs, are really transforming how we evaluate new medicines.
They're not just some niche thing anymore.
Yeah. No, not at all. They're becoming more and more common across a wide range of diseases and drug types,
We've seen that.
from cancer to biologics to those localized treatments for inflammatory conditions.
And they're making the whole process more efficient and giving us better information.
Exactly. And ultimately, that means we can get closer to developing more personalized and more effective treatments for patients.
And I think it also highlights how much clinical trial design is evolving,
It is. It's a dynamic field.
always adapting to the complexity of biology
Yeah.
and the need to get those new treatments to patients as quickly and as safely as possible.
Absolutely. These examples really give us a glimpse into the future of drug development.
Yeah.
Trials are becoming more responsive, more tailored to each individual patient
hmm
and to the specific characteristics of the drug being tested.
So here's something for everyone listening to think about.
Okay.
Given how sophisticated and widespread these innovative trial designs are becoming, how do you think they're going to change the landscape of pharmaceutical research and development in the years to come?
That's a great question.
Think about the impact on how quickly new drugs get to market, the cost of drug development,
Right.
and ultimately the treatment options that are available to patients.
It's a really fascinating area with so much potential to change how we approach treating diseases.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
See you then.